Good morning, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you today to the event on Japan, UK Transition Finance, co-organized by FinCity.Tokyo and JIJI Press with kind support from the City of London Corporation and the City UK. My name is Zuchan Mao. I'm the head of Asia Pacific from the City UK. Japan has been a pioneering implementing transition finance in its net zero strategy, while the UK has launched the Transition Finance Market Review, which looked at its potential and its challenges. So we are delighted to be joined today by a number of distinguished guests and speakers for a stimulating discussion on which bring together the experiences and insights accumulated by both countries. To open our event, I'm delighted to invite Mr. Nobuto Santo, London Bureau Chief of JIJI Press, to say a few words. Santo-san, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Ohayou gozaimasu. My name is Nobuto Sato, and I represent the London Bureau of JIJI Press. Thank you very much for joining us today, both in person and online. We are delighted to co-organize this forum today in partnership with FinCity.Tokyo, the City of London, and the City UK. JIJI Press is a Japanese news agency that covers a wide range of current affairs, including most recently the widely discussed welfare reform bill and the ongoing heat wave across Europe. In addition to our news coverage, we operate the London Top Seminar that provides a platform for executives of Japanese companies and organizations based in London to attend lectures and engage in networking opportunities. Today's theme, transition finance, is a highly effective tool, a pursuit of a net zero society. We are also pleased to see many members of our top seminars who have a strong interest in this field attending today's event. We hope this forum proves to be a valuable experience for all participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Santo-san. Now we are honored to have keynotes from two distinguished speakers. I'd like to first invite Laura Sharma, Chair of the UK's Transition Finance Council, to provide a few remarks. Laura Sharma.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's great to see so many of you here. And I start by thanking our friends at FinCity.Tokyo for leading the organization of this event, and of course to JIJI Press as well for all of their support. And it was wonderful to meet Nakasu-san and some of his team in Tokyo a few months ago, a real pleasure. And so I'd like to extend a very warm British welcome to all of you, your whole team, on my behalf, but also on behalf of all the colleagues from the UK Transition Finance Council. I think the aim of today's forum is to exchange ideas, to discuss collaboration, and ultimately also our shared ambition when it comes to transition finance. And I do think we have a lot to learn from what Japan has done in terms of transition finance. And of course, we will also have the opportunity to share our own experiences in the UK. I'm absolutely delighted that the brilliant Vanessa Howard-Williams, who's here, and the equally brilliant Faith Ward, who is also here. Where is Faith? I saw her earlier. There she's at the back. they've covered the front and the back. You won't be able to leave. They're going to lead the discussion from the UK side. And Vanessa and Faith chair two of the Transition Finance Council's working groups. And of course, Vanessa was also the author of the UK's, and I think it's not over-exaggerating when I say that it is a seminal piece of work, the Transition Finance Market Review, which ultimately has kicked off all of our work in the UK in this area, including actually the setting up of the Transition Finance Council, which Vanessa was one of your recommendations from the review. So friends, just want to talk a little bit about my relationship with Japan. I was Minister for Asia and the Pacific in the Foreign Office a number of years ago, and had some very happy and useful discussions with the Japanese government at the time. But my most memorable visit to Japan was actually in April 2021, as we in the UK were making preparations for COP26. I had the opportunity to actually interact with some of our colleagues who are here today, who very kindly organized roundtables during that visit. And I also had the opportunity to then to meet with the then Prime Minister, Suga. I thanked him for his personal leadership on climate action and for Japan's commitment, which was made in October 2020, to achieve net zero by 2050. In that conversation, where Minister Koizumi, my dear friend, was also present, I requested the Prime Minister to make sure that the Japanese government set out an ambitious 2030 NDC, nationally determined contribution target. And I was really pleased that a number of days after my visit, Prime Minister Suga announced Japan's NDC, 46% reduction in emissions by 2030, but with a goal and a target of 50% reduction. I was incredibly grateful at that point to the Japanese government for their ambition in this area, and of course, all the support that we in the UK got in the lead up to and actually at COP26 itself. And of course, in the context of our discussion today, in May 2021, Japan introduced their guidelines on climate transition finance. And I know we're going to hear a lot more on the progress that's been made in this agenda from Nakasu-san. And perhaps, Nakasu-san, in your remarks, you might want to talk to us and tell us a little bit about what the transition finance strategic priority is for Japan. Why has this become such a focus? And actually, where does this fit into Japan's wider economic and climate strategy? And of course, you've been issuing transition bonds. I think we have a lot to learn from that. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how that has progressed and what is the investor appetite for such instruments, because I think we're keen to learn. Now, ladies and gentlemen, many governments, including, of course, here in the UK and in Japan, and businesses and financial institutions, recognize the huge economic opportunity of transitioning the global economy. And we also know that it's going to require private finance. It's going to require transition finance. It's going to require trillions of dollars a year, because we're going to have to transition every single sector, including those high-emitting sectors as well. Now, the good news is that we know the transition is possible, and we know that from looking at the energy sector. We've seen solar costs fall by 15%, by 80% over the last 15 years. Wind is now the cheapest form of energy in many parts of the world. And last year, clean energy investment globally outpaced investment in fossil fuels by a margin of 2 to 1. And that margin, by the way, I think is going to continue to grow. These aren't just environmental wins, they're economic wins. Jobs are being created, new industries being built, literally from the ground up. Now, of course, the transition in clean energy is absolutely vital. I mean, at the end of the day, 75% of global emissions are energy related. But it alone won't get us all the way to net zero emissions global economy. We also need to help these hard-to-abate sectors such as steel, cement, heavy transport, chemicals. Basically, we're going to have to help them move from the gray to the green, because it matters for companies trying to stay competitive. It matters for investors looking to future-proof investment opportunities. It matters for workers looking for jobs, secure jobs in the industries of the future. And I just want to be very clear about this. We're not here talking about some great moral imperative to decarbonize. This is all about economics, pure and simple. Failing to decarbonize ultimately risks corporate profitability, or indeed, even worse. So let's talk about the market opportunity. According to Bloomberg, total energy transition investment and spending mobilized globally last year was just over $2 trillion. And that's a similar figure to that put out by the International Energy Agency. The UK itself mobilized $65 billion last year, and in fact, it was the fourth highest number of all countries globally. But here's the thing. Whilst overall global transition investment grew by 17% between 2023 and 2024, almost all of this money, over 90% of this investment, went into commercially mature technologies. Only around 7% went into emerging technologies. And actually, given the importance on the journey to net zero, collaboration between governments and the private sector is really going to have to scale up to de-risk and accelerate the investment that's needed in emerging technologies. And actually, there is a further challenge, because if you take out China from the numbers, the capital flows to emerging economies actually remains pretty limited. I think it's around sort of 15% of the total flows went to other developing and emerging economies. And frankly, that's where there's going to be the big challenge in terms of energy demand growth, which then leads to emissions growth as well. So we're going to need to broaden the reach of transition finance into harder to abate sectors, into earlier stage technologies, and into helping developing economies. Now, the UK Transition Finance Council is taking practical steps to realize the ambition that we have for the UK to be the place to raise transition finance. We've got these 3 working groups on integrity, on transition roadmaps and scaling finance. And we are bringing together the voices from the finance sector, from industry, from government and civil society around the table to try and find solutions. Together, we're aiming to build the practical foundations for a UK transition finance market that is open, that is investable, and that is aligned with international standards. Now, during London Climate Action Week, we launched a call for evidence on the role of sector transition roadmaps in unlocking transition finance, targeting real-world examples and insights. We also published a discussion paper outlining early thinking on the new transition finance guidelines to boost credibility and integrity in the market. And I know that Vanessa and Faith will talk a lot more about this work that we've been doing. But of course, the work that we are doing here in the UK is not happening in a vacuum. I mean, we're seeing this momentum around the world, and we want to cooperate with like-minded partners. So I hope, Nakasa-san, you might want in your remarks to address the issue of how we might cooperate further. Because frankly, Japan is a leading example of countries developing transition taxonomies. Corporates are being asked to publish credible transition plans. There are meaningful discussions going on about using blended finance and targeted subsidies to channel capital to where it's most needed. And frankly, it's why the work of the Council on sector transition pathways and transition finance guidelines absolutely matters, because it sends a strong signal that the UK is totally serious about shaping a high-integrity, globally interoperable transition finance market. And in our close working with the UK government, I can tell you that we are highlighting to them very clearly the concrete initiatives and policies which need to be put in place to give investors the clarity and confidence they need to be willing to raise, be able to raise and deploy transition finance at scale. So let me end with this. We have seen progress globally on climate finance, on transition finance, and climate action over the past few years. But right now, we are seeing some headwinds on climate action to transitioning the global economy to net zero. However, political rhetoric does not change the basic science. The world is getting hotter, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been absolutely crystal clear. Human activity is unequivocally responsible. You all know that last year, for the first time, we breached, temporarily at least, the totemic goal that all countries agreed in the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 to limit average global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Indeed, you'll have seen in recent weeks warnings from some scientists that this breach could actually become permanent in just a few years' time at current levels of carbon dioxide emissions. We see the negative impact of this global warming on many millions of lives and livelihoods and on infrastructure around the world. The Global Climate Risk Register, friends, has been flashing red for quite some time. But if we are prepared to act boldly and pragmatically on deploying a lot more transition finance at scale, the rewards are huge. Economic growth, the creation of new industries and good jobs, a transition built around people, workers, communities, consumers, which is just and lasting. Friends, this is not just a climate story. It is the economic story of the 21st century. Let's write it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Sharma. Next, can I please invite Mr. Hiroshi Nakaso, Chair of FinCity.Tokyo, to the stage, please.
Good morning, everyone. It's my real pleasure coming back to London, where I used to work a couple of decades ago. Now, time and again, we hear from the meteorological agency, it's going to be the hottest summer in history, almost every year. As a matter of fact, upon my departure from Tokyo, I was informed that it has been the hottest month of June in Japan. I thought I was going to escape the heat by coming over to London, but when I landed, I was surprised by the heat wave. So I think this is another reminder that climate change is something we must collectively act, regardless, as we heard from Lord Sharma, regardless of political rhetorics. Now, Lord Sharma, you asked me a couple of questions. Let me try to address the questions you raised one by one. Now, with regard to the big picture about the Japanese transition financing policy, I think there's a broad agreement in the Japanese business community to incentivize not just green projects, but also amber projects that can be and that can enable companies to realistically transition to achieve net zero goals. And given the diverse Japanese industry base, not all companies can become green overnight. And therefore, I think it makes sense to move in steps in transition to decarbonization without moving the 2050 target backwards. But the transition requires massive amount of money. And the Japanese government estimates as much as 150 trillion yen of investment is required in the next decade to achieve the carbon neutrality goal. And against this backdrop, the government has decided to issue 20 trillion yen of so-called climate transition bonds in the corresponding period. Now, besides these transition bonds, other forms of financing, I think, are necessary, and they include, for example, blended finance, so this risk mitigation elements, and carbon credits, which generate cash flow. Now, from the broader perspective of economic policies, I think decarbonization constitutes an important pillar of Japan's growth strategy. And this slide shows you in solid black line the movements of potential growth rates of Japan since the 1980s, and its contributing factors in bars in different color. The secular kind of decline in the potential growth rate can be explained by a sharp contraction in capital stock or capital expenditure in pink color, and a stagnant total factor of productivity, or TFP, which represents innovation expressed in the blue color. So decarbonization can be a game changer, I think, as it requires large-scale capital expenditure and technological innovation, and both of which, as I mentioned, are key ingredients of economic growth. So I think transition to carbon neutrality is a ideal growth strategy. Losham, you also asked me about the basic guidelines, so I'm going to talk about this. This slide shows the guidelines, which comprise 4 elements or key principles that you see in the upper side of the table. Under the basic guidelines, sector-specific roadmaps for high-emitting industries were compiled. And there are now 10 such roadmaps. And in each roadmap, types of investment are specified that can be regarded as transitory. Thus, these roadmaps became a kind of benchmark for the issuance of transition bonds, and the proceeds of which were used to finance investment projects that were needed to firms in these sectors to transition to net zero goals. The easiest example, for example, is an aviation company bought an aircraft by the proceeds of the transition bond. The airplane that the company bought was an airplane that runs on sustainable aviation fuel. So this is a typical example. And as this slide shows, thus far, 23 companies have issued 79 transition yen-denominated domestic bonds equivalent to $8.4 billion. What we learned from the market participant is that the cost of the issuance of these transition bonds have generally been slightly lower than non-ESG corporate straight bonds by several basis points. I think this implies that transition bonds are in the process of being recognized as a new asset class. I think the government's climate transition bond played, in this regard, a catalytic role, mobilizing private capital. One issue that I think needs to be focused on going forward is the compatibility, if you like, with other transition financing initiatives in the broader Asia-Pacific region. As I see, similar but different efforts are underway elsewhere in the region, as shown on this slide. And many economies develop their own taxonomies with an amber part in between. For example, ASEAN taxonomy, as you see, has a multi-layered approach where 2 tiers of amber are intended to ensure more inclusivity for ASEAN member states to move in steps to carbon neutrality. Now, these taxonomy approaches are diverse and, of course, different from Japan's industrial sector-specific roadmap approach that I have just mentioned. That said, all of these frameworks have commonalities, if you like, in that they refer to GFAN's strategies and try to identify the relevant and essential economic activities that are considered environmentally sustainable. And therefore, an important task, I think, going forward is to find ways to make these approaches, different approaches, compatible, credible, consistent, and interoperable across the region so that business companies can access the large-scale financing. And I think there's a clear rationale for closer collaboration with the ASEAN economies, which are dynamic and have strong potential for growth. And to this end, as I understand, Japan's Financial Services Agency has launched the Asia GX Consortium last year, creating a platform for practical engagement with ASEAN countries. So let's move on to the next question. Possible opportunity for UK-Japan collaboration. Of course, in a generic way, we are more than happy to collaborate with your Transition Finance Council so that we can learn from each other. One possible area for such kind of collaboration is an expansion of voluntary carbon market. This is a private sector initiative led by ABAC, which stands for APEC Business Advisory Council, to develop a network of interoperable voluntary carbon credit markets in the Asia-Pacific region. This slide shows you the concept design, which illustrates what ABAC is up to. It shows, as an example, this is an example, a case in which an Indonesian electric power company reduced carbon emission by early retirement of a coal-fired power plant, replaced by a more efficient energy like liquid natural gas with lesser degree of emission. Part of this reduced emission can be sold as carbon credits to domestic as well as overseas markets like Tokyo, Singapore, elsewhere in the region. So it creates cash flow. It creates cash flow. So business companies in the region that are on transition to decarbonization can purchase carbon credits to offset their residual carbon emissions. In this way, I think the economies across the region can collectively become green quicker than otherwise. The ABAC initiative this year entered into the second phase of this initiative and launched a Pathfinder initiative. There are 4 goals, but among others, we plan, which is the fourth point is the main part. We plan to run a pilot project to connect exchanges in the region. And as the chart below shows, this will be done by a shared blockchain platform to execute cross-border trading of quality voluntary carbon credits. This Pathfinder initiative has received participation of 9 economies thus far from the region, but in the future, the network can be expanded to encompass larger geographical region. So if, of course, the UK is interested, you're more than welcome to share our experiences and exercises of this Pathfinder initiative. Finally, I want to touch on what we might expect as a tangible outcome of transition financing exercises in the next 12 months. We expect to see an emergence of new types of financial instruments, and for example, issuance of fixed-rate long-term bonds in which the currency is now this kind of exercise now being explored. This type of bond reduces, if not eliminates, the currency risk or exchange risk, both for issuers and investors, and thus are expected to contribute to smooth transition financing. This slide shows you a specific plan that we are exploring at this moment. And this is the issuance of AAA rated bond index to World Parity Unit, or WPU, which, as you see on the slide, is a currency unit comprising a basket of 11 currencies as calculated and published by FTSE Russell. If everything goes fine, we might see a landmark issuance by a multilateral development bank later this year. So I hope this kind of consensus on the significance of developing more efficient means of transition financing will be discussed and be reached on consensus at the forthcoming COP30. So this concludes my brief presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nagaso-san. Can I now invite Vanessa Harold Williams, Chair of the Transition Finance Market Review, to share with us the review's key findings and the future direction of UK's transition finance journey. Vanessa.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, FinCity, for organizing this. It was such a good idea and delighted to be here. So let's see if I can manage the slides. So briefly, in relation to the Transition Finance Market Review, first of all, it wasn't just me, it was lots of other very wonderful people who engaged in this. But if I start off, this was a review that was commissioned by government, by the Treasury and by the Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero, but it was led by the market. The aim of it was less in relation to how the UK transitions, though that was clearly a part, but it was very much looking at the opportunities for the UK as a major financial and professional services centre and the role that it could take in supporting the transition of economies all around the world. So it was the UK and it was everywhere else. And the essay question that we were set was what would be necessary, what recommendations could we make to enable the UK to be a market hub for high quality transition finance. We were asked to look systematically at barriers and also to consider opportunities and then to propose solutions. And we proposed solutions in a very even-handed way towards the market, towards industry and towards the government as well. So, in terms of the approach that we took, we did the kind of things that you would expect us to do. We did a big document review. But I think the key element was that I was supported by an expert group that represented all parts of the market that we could think of. So from the corporates, through insurance, through financial subsectors, civil society. And we did a huge amount of engagement. So you'll see that we did a large number of roundtables, a lot of bilaterals, and that gave us the depth of evidence that supported the conclusions that we drew. Most of the evidence gathering was UK focused, but it wasn't limited to the UK. So we also engaged with financial regulators around the world. We did reach outs and visits to South Africa, Singapore, Hong Kong, to my great regret, not Japan, but hopefully there will be opportunities to collaborate in future. We worked with officials, but I think it's fair to say that the government component was relatively muted. We did work actively with our financial regulators, with the Bank of England and with the FCA, who were both observers. So what did we find? There was a lot of response to our call for evidence in relation to a lack of consensus around definition and what credibility means and how that could be articulated. And we also got a significant amount of evidence about greenwashing risk and an emphasis in existing regulation across Europe and the UK as to what green finance is. So there was a focus and a lot of work on defining green, and that created a bit of a chill around transition themes and strategies. There was a real concern about the lack of long-term real economy policy that could enable transition of high-emitting sectors, and also concerns about regulatory certainty. So a concern about rapid policy changes, and also concern about issues like planning, permitting, just taking too long. Those are familiar concerns. And then the other issue that I think comes out quite clearly in the review is that for financial sectors to engage, the opportunities have to be investable. It's not realistic to expect capital to flow if the projects or the activities are not investable. And that brings us back to having adequate real economy policy at a really detailed level and appropriate mechanisms and catalytic capital. So we included a whole number of recommendations. I was originally asked for 5. You will see from the review that we extended well beyond that. We included recommendations around how to establish credibility and integrity. And we used the GFAN's transition finance strategies as the basis for classifying and thinking through transition finance. We added a further build in that we differentiated between activity level finance, which is typically use of proceeds or SPV focused, and entity level finance, where we got feedback from the market that this is much harder, more challenging to engage with without clear transition levers. So we developed that work and we continue to work on that within the Transition Finance Council. In relation to entity level finance, we saw transition planning as core to that. And we recommended mandatory transition plans and the development of the ecosystem to ensure assessment of credibility and assurance. I said that a key part was real economy policy. We also recommended sector transition maps, and we saw that fitting within national transition planning, leveraging the work that the G20 was doing last year, and also LSE CETEX had done a lot of work on that too. So seeing a national transition plan, boiling down into sector pathways or roadmaps, and also the potential for countries to develop investment plans that could then feed into their sovereign bond issuance programs, which sounds very much like the process that Japan has been working on. There is a piece around unlocking capital for the climate solutions and the climate enablers. So the growth areas and innovative technologies that are being developed and that need to be further supported. And for that, we looked at the use of public financial institutions to play a more strategic role in relation to catalytic capital. But we also looked at other mechanisms, including in particular the role that insurance can play. And as a leading center for insurance, there's real opportunity. We saw some of that coming out in London Climate Action Week with the amazingly popular Howden event on Monday. And we looked and had a deep dive in relation to the opportunities and the additional challenges and barriers that are engaged in relation to unlocking finance for emerging markets and developing economies. And finally, which is what brings us here today, we made recommendations in relation to governance, capacity building, and the opportunities for collaboration. The whole market lent into this review. I was absolutely determined it was not going to be a pretty report that stayed in a drawer. And for that reason, we recommended the establishment of the Transition Finance Council to be the custodian of the recommendations and to drive forward progress and report on it. So what happened next? We launched in mid-October. We had a very supportive response from the FCA and from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who supported the creation of the Transition Finance Council. And that was co-sponsored by the City of London Corporation, who have been stellar throughout in supporting us, providing our secretariat, And we benefit from Ashley Lee, who has co-led the TFMR Secretariat and who now leads the Transition Finance Council Secretariat. Since then, we've been incredibly lucky to have Lord Sharma agree to chair the council, and we've built out a great steering committee. So I'm going to skip quickly on to the next bit, which is broadly in developing our thinking and thinking about how we deploy all the bodies who have lent into the council and to build on the work of the Transition Finance Market Review, we identified 3 different work streams that the market could continue to drive forward, as well as the advocacy we do with government and the potential for the council to engage in international collaboration. The first is in relation to credibility and integrity, and that's a working group I chair. We are looking at building out the initial work we did in the review on guidelines, where we had focused very much on activity level finance. We are now working on guidelines for finance at entity level. The intention of these is to be high level, principles based, and capable of operating on a global basis. So they are genuinely going to be quite high level, but creating credibility guardrails. And the intention is to create a level set across the market. So it's not best practice, this is your starting point. And we expect them to inform the development of transition finance frameworks and other financial institution frameworks of their own. Chris Skidmore is working on pathways, policies, and governance, and Lord Sharma has mentioned that piece of work. He's got a call for evidence out now. And Faith is working on scaling transition finance. So Faith and I are working very closely together because her input informs and her group's input informs the guidelines we're developing. And we are looking at ways of piloting transition finance structures and also collecting case studies of what has gone well and what has gone not so well and how those issues can be unblocked. And so that is the work for the next 9 months to create to continue growing the toolbox for transition finance. So I'm going to pause now and just, Naomi, would you like me to take questions, or have you got time? Four minutes for questions if you've got any, otherwise I will go back and sit down. Any questions? Of course you can ask a question.
Which is, in terms of the response to government, just in headline terms, what UK government in this area trying to push forward this issue? So just in terms of the UK government, are there any sort of headlines in terms of areas where you would like to see a progress over the next sort of 9 to 12 months?
Overarching theme, the dots all need to be joined. Governments suffer from silos. This is a horizontal issue. We need to keep everybody talking to each other and aligning. We've asked for a transition finance lab to unlock, to test, unlock, and disclose and discuss with the market different structures and different ways of working. I think I'd definitely like to see that. And also building on what I said earlier about public financial institutions, there's a real opportunity there to make those, to reframe the mandates of those institutions to capture the challenge that we're going through so that they are looking to be more catalytic and they've got some flexibility in terms of the returns that they're seeking and that is smoothed across the transactions that they do. So I think those are big things. And then there are also other areas that you can look at to just look at financial regulation and work out where there are frictions that don't need to be there, that would smooth transition finance and unlock the flow of patient capital, for example. Thank you very much. Oh, another one.
I was going to ask, to what extent do you think we need carbon tax border adjustments to turbocharge this transition finance?
That is a really good question. I think when our largest neighbour has carbon border adjustment mechanisms in place, it's quite hard for us to operate without them. But also, I think there are challenges which some emerging markets have already identified. There is an opportunity also to think about, both in relation to CBAM and in relation to emissions trading, whether there is a component, small tranche that can be utilised to replace some of the gaps that I see in ODA funding, and that may be an opportunity for voluntary carbon market inputs. That clearly needs quite a lot of work to address the issues that we've had over the last 2 years in terms of publicity about adverse carbon market projects. But there is work going on that, and I think the recent consultation is very much welcomed on those issues. I think otherwise we better stop after this one, otherwise I'll get into terrible trouble.
Sorry to bring you into terrible trouble. The question is this one of systemic change versus incremental now. Obviously, transition finance is looking to do some form of systemic change, but if we look at the history of work that's been done so far, do you believe it is profound enough? By no means am I advocating for anything like a shock doctrine in terms of the way we tried to transition the former Soviet Union. However, if we look at the litigation that is happening around climate change and the liability potentially that it is arising through legal frameworks, do you think we are being ambitious enough in terms of the profundity of change that we are seeking in our agenda or in the vision that we have? Thank you.
Well, that was another good question. I think you're right, it's a systemic issue. I think you have to be careful about keeping everybody with you. Because if you go too fast and your communication is poor, then you run into difficulties in terms of social acceptance of what you're doing and why you're trying to do it. I think we do have the tools. The area where I am always impatient because I am because I'm 35 years in private sector is pace. So I worry about pace and I chivvy on pace, but I do think we have the tools. I also think that litigation is a tool that is definitely a part of the jigsaw, but needs to be very carefully deployed, because litigation can have a real chilling effect on people's willingness to take, to change their ordinary course of business. And actually that is what we need. We need people to be willing to accept change and to, at the margins, take a little bit of risk. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Vanessa, for such a comprehensive presentation. Can I now please invite Matsuda-san Minister for Financial Affairs at the Japanese Embassy in London to provide the keynote, where he will share with us Japan's approach to transition finance. Matsuda-san.
Good morning, distinguished guests. My name is Yasuhiro Matsuda. I'm Minister for Financial Affairs of the Embassy of Japan in the UK. So today, I would like to introduce Japan climate transition bonds and the approach to transition finance of the Financial Services Agency of Japan. Well, first of all, I'd like to give you a quick overview of Japan's GX economy transition bonds, as well as our climate transition bonds, also known as CT bonds. I briefly touch on the basic concept and where we currently stand in terms of issuance. Well, Japan has made an international commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Although Japan is surrounded by the sea and having limited natural resources, Japan needs a broad transition strategy for decarbonization to shift the entire economy and society, including hard-to-abate sectors, towards clean energy. This transformation, what we call the green transformation, or GX. To achieve decarbonization while improving industrial competitiveness and driving economic growth, Japan expects to need more than 150 trillion yen of GX-related investments, including contributions from the private sector. To make this happen, the government plans to issue around 20 trillion yen in GX economy transition bonds over a 10-year period, starting in 2023, to conduct upfront investments. We have issued Japan Climate Transition Bonds, the world's first government transition bond, in February 2024 as part of the GX economy transition bonds. The redemption of these bonds will be funded by revenues from carbon pricing systems. So far, we have issued 6 times, totaling about 3 trillion yen. For this fiscal year, we plan to issue another 1.2 trillion yen through 4 auctions. The next auction is scheduled for July 15th with 300 billion yen on offer. So I hope you will keep an eye on it. In Japan, we have established a framework that forms the basis for CT bonds. This framework clearly defines how the funds will be used. It is aligned with international standards, including the ICMA Green Bond Principles and the Climate Transition Finance Handbook. The framework sets out Japan's transition strategy, how the funded proceeds will be allocated, and our approach to reporting. We have been working to deepen investors' understanding of CT bonds and promote their wider adoption. Currently, we are conducting IR investor relations activities, both domestic and overseas, in close collaboration with the private sector. Our efforts focus on clear and effective communication through one-on-one meetings and seminars with investors. We occasionally receive feedback from investors during our investor relations meetings regarding the transparency of CT bonds. As part of our efforts to enhance transparency, we published the allocation report in this March, also available in English, summarizing how the proceeds for the fiscal year 2023 were used. The report not only explains the allocation of funds, but also includes the estimates of the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, making it a useful resource for promoting transparency. These efforts have been positively received by investors in our IR activities. We are planning to publish a more detailed full version of the impact report around next February. As the issuing authority, the Ministry of Finance of Japan will work closely with the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry to make sure the report is meaningful and reflects investor perspectives. That concludes the basic overview of Japan's GX economy transition bonds and climate transition bonds. Next, I'd like to talk about the approach to transition finance of the FSA. The Asia GX Consortium is a vital initiative. Asia accounts for roughly half of global GHG emissions and continues to experience significant economic growth. Therefore, scaling up GX investment in the region is crucial for global decarbonization. The FSA, in collaboration with ASEAN financial authorities, is leading the effort to develop a practical and unified approach to expanding transition finance projects in Asia. Well, finally, I'd like to touch upon the working group on financial infrastructure for carbon credit transactions. Building on global discussions, such as the IOSCO's report on voluntary carbon markets, the FSA started this working group in June last year. It aims to discuss optimal market practices and trading infrastructure for carbon credit from a practical and professional perspective. We start with stock taking to identify best practices and potential vulnerabilities. We are especially focusing on transparency, market integrity, interoperability, governance, risk management, and so on to ensure investor protection. Last month, the FSA published a report summarizing the key issues related in improving the transparency and integrity of carbon transactions. The key takeaways are, for example, appropriate disclosure, preventing conflict of interest and compliance, ensuring customer-oriented business conduct, risk management, transparency and fairness of carbon rating agencies, how to position credit in users' climate strategies. In conclusion, Japan is committed to addressing climate change through climate transition bonds and strategic collaboration like the Asia GX Consortium. We believe a strong, transparent, and integrated approach to transition finance is essential for achieving global decarbonization goals. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Matsuda-san. I would now like to invite Takata-san, Director of the GX Acceleration Agency, to speak about how transition finance is pursued in Japan.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Hideki Takada. I'm the director at GX Acceleration Agency. Well, I suppose many of you here have not heard about GX Acceleration Agency. Well, there is no shame on it because our agency just started from last year. I will talk about it in a minute. So just a very brief introduction about who I am. And I am originally from the Ministry of Finance, like Minister Matsuda, who was the previous speaker. And this is my 30th year in my professional career. And out of the 30 years, I spent 5 years in the UK, including 3 years secondment to the HM Treasury. So the UK is like a second home country to me. And I started my commitment to this green agenda since when I was seconded to the OECD in Paris from 2015 to 18, where I was engaged in green finance. And since then, in one way or another, I was involved in green and sustainability agenda. And not written in this page, but in 2021,
I briefly worked for the cabinet office, climate change office in the cabinet under the Prime Minister Suga and Minister Koizumi, and there I hosted a kind of expert roundtable inviting Lord Sharma. Thank you, Lord Sharma, for coming to our office. And more recently, until last summer, I was working at the Financial Service Agency and leading various policies, including International Finance Center, asset management reform, and sustainable finance. And the July last year, the GX Acceleration Agency was launched by the government, and I am now seconded to this organization as its director. So, as discussed, Japan is taking forward GX or green transformation. Well, I think the GX is not a proper English word. Please teach me, so the English speakers. But actually, this was invented by the Japanese government. So it stands for the green transformation. But I hope that in the near future, this word GX is understood as such more or less globally. Anyway, so the GX aims to achieve the decarbonization or carbon neutrality by 2050, and at the same time to enhance industrial competitiveness and economic growth. So important thing here is that, as stressed by Lord Sharma in his speech, decarbonization, competitiveness, and economic growth are not in a trade-off relationship, but they can be achieved simultaneously, or they can be even enhancing each other. So that is a key concept behind Japan's GX approach. And in order to do this, we are going to make the investment into GX totaling 150 trillion yen in next 10 years, private and public money combined. And out of this 150 trillion yen, about 20 trillion yen will come from the government budget. And this is raised by issuance of the Japan Climate Transition Bond, which was just explained by Minister Matsuda. However, just 20 trillion from the government out of the total of 150 trillion yen, which means that the rest of the money, 130 trillion yen, must come from the private sector. So we are going to mobilize sustainable finance and transition finance, which is the focus of today's discussion. And our GX, Green Transformation Acceleration Agency, was launched by the government to drive forward this GX, and particularly to accelerate private sector investment into GX. And in order to do this, we take forward the 3 pillars of work which are written in red characters in this page. The first, we accelerate private sector investment into GX by providing financial support, such as credit guarantees or equity investment into private sector projects. Because often GX projects involve uncertain, innovative technologies, and that might be risky, too risky for private sector alone to undertake. So in such a case, our agency can step in and provide financial support, mitigate those risks, and make the projects go ahead. So in other words, we can provide a form of blended finance or catalytic capital, as mentioned by Vanessa. And secondly, we are going to introduce an emission trading system and carbon pricing mechanisms from next fiscal year. Our agency will administer those systems. And thirdly, we act as a kind of GX hub, which brings together financial sector, industry sector, and the government to promote the GX and sustainability in a society-wide manner, working with various stakeholders, both domestic and international. So here is some example of our activities as the GX hub. So in order to strengthen our global outreach, we established a global advisory council, which consists of 6 well-known experts in this area, including Ms. Sherry Madera, CEO of CTP, who is here in this venue too. Also, we are actively communicating the GX policies to stakeholders, both domestic and international. We are attending various events and conferences, not only in Tokyo, but including in regional areas in Japan or in overseas. So the right-hand picture is taken from the OECD Forum on Green Finance last October in Paris at a panel discussion. Again, I and Sherry are there. And of course, what I am doing now is just a part of this activity. And a good news for you is that if you look at the bottom line of this page, we will host our flagship event, JGX or Global GX Finance Summit on the 5th of November in Tokyo this year. Actually, this comes back to back with the ICMA ICMA's conference, also taking place in Tokyo on 6th of November. So the 5th November, our event, and the 6th November, ICMA event. So that is a very good period for you to visit Tokyo, if you have a chance. So more broadly, Japan is taking forward sustainable finance initiatives. So the first, well, as I discussed, we are promoting transition finance strongly. And secondly, we are promoting sustainability disclosure. So the FSA is now in the process of incorporating the ISSB standards S1 and S2 into Japan's domestic disclosure framework. And thirdly, we are enhancing transparency of ESG market, for example, by introducing the code of conduct for the providers of ESG evaluation and data. So this activity was followed by other jurisdictions, including the UK. And fourthly, we are promoting strongly the impact investment. So we established Impact Consortium, which is a kind of stakeholders of network of stakeholders of impact investments. And also June last year, the government clarified the relationship between the impact investment and the fiduciary duty of asset owners such as pension funds. So the government clarified that the impact investment is in line with the fiduciary duty of pension funds. So that made a way for large pension funds such as GPIF in Japan to start impact investment. So the transition finance, which is the focus of today's event, I suppose well, many of you already know what transition finance is, but just to recap why it is so important. So transition finance is a complementary concept to a typical green finance, such as green bond, often based on green taxonomies. So the green finance applies to those technologies that were classified as already green or low carbon, such as renewable energy. Of course, that is very important. However, the majority of technologies or industries in the economy are not yet green, not covered by those green taxonomies. However, those industries, those high-emitting industries, must also change towards decarbonization. Otherwise, we cannot achieve economy-wide decarbonization. And those industries need money now to make that change happen. So that is why the transition finance is needed for such industry. So as mentioned already by Nakasa-san, the Japanese government formulated the transition finance policy guidelines in 2021 and also published the sectoral transition roadmaps for a number of high-emitting sectors. And the recipient of transition finance must establish an entity-wide, corporate-wide transition strategy or transition plan, if you like. So this is going to be a corporate-wide, entity-wide effort. So we are calling this sector and entity-based approach. And also, important thing is that transition finance is not static, but it is a dynamic and forward-looking concept. So the question is not whether a certain industry is green or not today, but more importantly, how it evolves into decarbonization in the future. So transition finance needs regular monitoring about how the industry goes into the future. So in other words, transition finance is a more challenging but more substantial activity than typical green finance. So for that purpose, Japanese government also published a transition finance follow-up guidance, which can be used by the industry and the financial sector after conducting transition finance for their regular monitoring purpose. So I think transition finance was first met with a kind of skepticism around some corners of the community, particularly in Europe. So some people might think that this is a kind of greenwashing or something escaping from the typical stringent green finance. But it is not true. Just as I said, this is complementary to a typical green finance. And I think the understanding about this transition finance as a concept has improved dramatically in the last couple of years. So to give you some image about what the sectoral roadmaps look like, so just this is an example or image taken from the transition roadmap for the iron and steel sector. As you may know that iron and steel sector is the most hard to abate, most emitting industry. So this is the highest emitting industry in Japan and probably in many other jurisdictions too. By the way, this picture is so complicated and so small letters. So I don't expect you to just see the details about this. In any case, you don't have to know about technical details about steel industry. And I am not an expert in steel industry either. So anyway, so this is just to show you some images how it looks like. So just well, what I want to say from this is that well, this is mapping a number of possible or available technologies for decarbonizing the steel industry. So from the top, it starts from say improvement in blast furnace, which is the key current existing technology. So which can be available relatively quickly. And to the bottom end, there is the direct reduction of technologies using ultimately the hydrogen, which is a very innovative technology, which is not yet available. But in the end, these kind of technologies must come in order to fully decarbonize the steel sector. And this picture shows how the steel industry goes into net zero by 2050. So this curve shows how the emission from steel industry will decline over the time. And you can notice that after 2040, this curve become steeper, so which envisages that by the time of around 2040, a very innovative technologies such as direct hydrogen reduction may be available. And after that, they can achieve a steeper reduction in emission. So important thing here is that all those technologies are already in the vision of those steel makers. Also, many of them are not yet commercially available. But these are achievable. And so this shows you how even the most hard to abate sector, such as steel, can reach decarbonization by 2050. So, as I said, in the last couple of years, the acceptance about transition finance has improved over jurisdictions. So in 2023, Japan hosted the G7 summit in Hiroshima in Japan. And there, the G7 leaders confirmed the importance of transition finance in advancing the decarbonization of the economy as a whole. And also mentioned by Minister Matsuda, we have launched the Asia GX Consortium to work with particularly the ASEAN countries to promote the transition finance on the ground in Asian regions as well, because transition finance is a particularly important concept for many Asian countries, which are still heavily relying on fossil fuel and high-emitting industries. But of course, transition finance is important not only for Asia, but also for the UK, for Europe, America, and for the globe. So as already mentioned by many speakers, the UK is also very active in this area, like TPT, Transition Task Force, TFMR, Transition Finance Market Review, and now the TFC, Transition Finance Council. So another acronym coming out. But this means that how dynamic and active the UK is in this area. So obviously, there are many things, many areas in which the UK and Japan collaborate and lead the discussions in this area to contribute to the decarbonization across the globe. And I hope that today's event will be a good step forward toward that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matsuda-san and Takata-san. We'll now take a 20-minute coffee break. While you enjoy the refreshment, can I please encourage you to take a moment to view a special Ikeban flower arrangement displayed in the venue? It was created by Miss Tomoko Kenny of Brown Brothers Harriman, who is a trained Japanese flower artist. Can I? Oh, okay, great. So Ikeban is a tradition with over 550 years of history, a quite yet powerful reflection of beauty and harmony. So please do take this opportunity to enjoy it. Can I also please ask all the speakers to the stage for a group photo before we get to the coffee break? Thank you very much. Our next speaker, can I please have Nick Malby, the founding partner and CEO of E3G, to share his insights on green finance in a geopolitically challenged world. And also, please join me welcoming Nick and congratulating him and the E3G team on hosting the largest ever London Climate Action Week. Thank you.
Apologies for my late arrival. So thank you very much for the invitation and welcome to the second half of the talk. Just say my name's Nick Maybe. I'm the CEO of E3G and also the chair of London Climate Action Week for those of you who were here last week. So I just got a cough. We're an independent think tank that works globally on a range of issues, but particularly on finance and transition plans. We also have a small team in Japan alongside our European and US teams. Yeah, we were very pleased to talk to FinCity yesterday and plan out some cooperation. Thank you very much. With London Climate Action Week going forward. Now, I've been asked to talk, perhaps step back a bit and talk about transition finance in the broader context of a geopolitically complex world. I think that's a rather an understatement, perhaps the kind of complexity given the turmoil of the last 6 months, but I think it's a really important area. So I'm going to try to talk through a few ways of understanding how transition finance fits in this world, but also what needs to be done. But I think it's also to realize that the geopolitical impacts on transition finance are not just issues of kind of short-term decisions by leaders or of the immediate security and conflict problems we see in the world at the moment, though those are hugely important. It's actually driven by really fundamental forces. It's a feature, not a bug. And the first thing is that climate transition was always going to happen in a time of massive geopolitical resetting. From the time of the modeling in the 1970s on environmental limits, it was very clear that we would start hitting these limits when China and India and major developing countries really started industrializing. And that was when there wasn't enough demand in the OECD, essentially, to hit those limits. And when they started industrializing, obviously the balance of economic power and then political power and security power was going to shift. So we're always going to be going through these transitions to a zero carbon, resilient and sustainable economy at a point where geopolitical power is shifting in the world. And I think that's something we need to always acknowledge. And so transition finance and the governance of finance at all levels needs to be designed to work through this turbulence, which we're going to see in the world, and in terms of not just the individual pieces of the puzzle, but also the broad context. And I think that comes down to the idea, and it's been mentioned earlier, of an orderly transition, which is about creating conditions where not that everything's certain, not that every risk is removed, but that there's some kind of plan everybody's following. We have plans, but they're there to manage risk. But the level of risk and uncertainty is manageable inside our systems. Now, systems have to change to manage different types of risk and more risk, but the aim is to have an orderly and investable transition, because the transition is an investment play, as always know. And that governance needs to be much more forward-looking in many different ways. Much has to be understanding climate science and resilience science and broader industrial transitions in very different ways to the old ways. And I think it's useful to remember what the disorderly transition looks like. So the disorderly transition will be, well, we can't. There is no way of investing in the future. And two of the main scenarios are, firstly, if we don't act to limit emissions, and then we will definitely hit a point where impacts hit very strongly, and we have potentially a crash program where governments move very quickly to eliminate carbon from our systems in various different ways. But there's also a shock that's not because of our inaction, even though we are not acting fast enough, which is where the climate science gets worse. And if you read the latest science, you'll see that the observations, not models, observations of climate science is, in the last 15 years, climate has been accelerating at twice the rate of temperature than is average in the models. So all the things you're using to stress test are underestimating the rate of change. That will have profound impacts on how governments respond. So disorderly transitions will be much more state-led, and they'll be much more hard to invest against, but they are an inevitable result of the physics if we don't act or if the physics gets worse. And at the moment, the physics of climate change should be seen as having a negative bias, so it's worse than we think on average. And also, the world is not investing enough in resilience. So our vulnerability should also be seen with a negative bias, because we are off track hugely in every country in investing in resilience. So the core part of achieving that orderly transition is to improve financial governance at the macro, prudential, sovereign, fiscal, and market level. And I think that's where, and all of those should improve our financial resilience, and transition finance, transition planning, taxonomies are core parts of improving that financial resilience, not just in terms of directing capital. But I think one of the things I want to talk about is where beyond, it's necessary to do those transition plans, but we also need to get those macro policy conditions right. And that's where the industry needs to work with policymakers to make sure those things beyond its control are in the right place. And I'm going to talk through 3 examples. The first one is maintaining investment momentum. Now, we did $2.1 trillion in clean investment last year. That's an increase of over 5 times since the Paris Agreement was signed. So I think that's a successful agreement in investment terms. But we need to triple that globally and 6 times in major economies, major emerging economies, if we're going to get on track to net zero by 2050. But what we know from the tariff wars and policy uncertainty we're seeing is the economic uncertainty index has massively increased. And the IMF has downgraded growth forecasts. And a combination of lower growth and higher economic uncertainty is just the thing that puts investors off investing in long-term assets. So there is a headwind, a macroeconomic headwind driven by geopolitics on the project of investment. And of course, if there's no normal investment, making investment green is not going to work either. So that's a big problem. So it's really important that governments send a really strong signal that the momentum in the clean sectors is moving forward. So the first one, which has already happened, is announcing major public investment projects. So Germany, UK, obviously Japan with GX. China is like to come out with one soon. So there's a kind of key, I wouldn't call it a stimulus, more of a kind of investment push in these areas to move forward. And that should be backed up by ambitious NDCs. And we're still, Europe has just put forward the 90%, which is incredibly ambitious. We're waiting for China, waiting for India. Again, the signal that will send to market is incredibly important. And it's really important that's combined with continue to send that signal about integrating climate into financial markets. And we're really pleased to see, against the US and some of the European backdrop, really strong message coming out of London Climate Action Week that China, Singapore, UK, Japan are still moving forward on that. Because again, it's an important signal. And lastly, we need to make sure we're using our public bank systems, not just the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, but also our bilaterals to really drive and de-risk capital into developing countries. Because that's how we keep momentum up. And I think one of the key areas we're looking at for those signals to come from is the EU-China summit at the end of July, but there's also an EU-Japan summit at leaders level just before. And I think there's a real opportunity for Europe and Japan to send a very powerful message on those economic momentum that we're going to be moving forward. So that's the economic momentum. We can manage that, but it needs a kind of political impetus. Secondly, it's resilience to shocks. There's a bunch of shocks, lots of known unknowns, as we used to say, out there, which we need to make sure we're resilient against, need to be incorporated into both transition planning and stress testing, but also into macro policy. The first one is obviously climate impacts. And those of you who read the FT scenario of kind of global financial instability caused by insurance markets collapsing, we'll see that is a real issue that's happening now and we know is not fully integrated in our regulation. The second one should also be obvious, it's energy price shocks. It's not far from Ukraine, had an enormous fiscal impact, enormous economic impact on change. And that was, the UK's modeled that energy shock before. Our economic regulator shows that the impact of a Ukraine-sized shock on the UK fiscally, just in terms of tax receipts, is twice as large as the fiscal impact of the whole low carbon transition, including losing all fuel duty. It's £25 billion a year in fuel duty in the UK by the move to electric cars. We're not taking energy shocks seriously in our macro forecasting. And lastly, transition shocks. And it's, electric vehicles are a geopolitical phenomenon. And the European-China negotiations over electric vehicles, which is mirrored by tariffs in Brazil and Indonesia, Turkey against Chinese electric vehicles, show this transition is a fundamental geopolitical context. And it will lead to escalation or de-escalation in trade. So again, I think there's a need to understand this is not just a technological transition, it's a huge issue there. But moving towards a managed market, an agreement on that doesn't cause macro spillovers, incredibly important for financial investment. So I think effective transition plan and stress testing can help with all of those shocks. But I think it's also an area where the industry and governments need to work together to look at how to manage those risks from a policy and diplomatic point of view, and to integrate them in macro planning, because that creates conditions for transition finance at the market level to work. And then the last one is global regulatory risk. So a huge amount of work has been done since the Paris Agreement on incorporating climate risk into macroeconomics, the central banks, the prudential regulation, much more than anybody expected, to be honest, at the Paris Agreement when this process was started. But obviously, we're seeing the US pull back from some of these fora. We're seeing the G7 and G20 finding it very hard to talk about climate change. I mean, those are the big motors of financial regulation. The US is obviously staying in the IMF and the World Bank and Basel, but we don't know quite what will happen to their ability to manage these issues. And it's really important, and as someone mentioned it, particularly for emerging economies where the real growth needs to go, because they're locked in a high-risk perception and a point where it's very hard for them to invest in energy transitions or resilience, given their fiscal space, and they get no kind of benefits in terms of their credit rating by building resilience in their economy. And this doom loop is something being discussed in Seville at the moment in Finance for Development. But we need to change how we score investment at the IMF and the credit rating agencies, and this process is going on there to come up with debt sustainability frameworks in 2026. But will we have the votes in those organizations actually do the reforms? So I think that's where it's really key. We form new alliances, and I think Europe and the UK and Japan, with China and others, have a real interest in making sure those reforms go forward, because they provide, again, the backdrop for growing markets outside the current investors in the clean transition to a broader set of countries. And I think the Baku to Belém roadmap, which some of you might be aware of, the Brazilians are working on at the moment. There was a big sessions in the margins of London Climate Action Week on prudential regulation. They're taking comments and advisory to set out essentially an agreed consensus roadmap among countries for financial reform going forward to meet the 1 trillion and 3 trillion investment, which is needed in emerging economies over the next 10 years, a year, that of 1.3 trillion. So that's a place we can land ideas and set an agenda for governments to go forward, which will be discussed but not negotiated at the COP this year. So there are lots of areas of risk beyond markets that affect markets. There's lots we can do about it, but that's only going to happen if we work together in different formations. So my message to this conference, and it's one of the most powerful things, so glad that Japanese colleagues over here, is we need to identify areas where new coalitions are needed to manage all of those different pieces on economic confidence, on shocks, on prudential and regulatory risk, so that all the good work on transition planning at the market and firm level is firmly embedded inside a safe and prudential structure that allows investors to carry on taking risks, moving money, and building the clean and resilient economy we all need. Thank you. Is there any time for questions? I left a time. Okay, people, is there a microphone or are we just shouting? Just shouting, I think, is the answer. I think it's a broader question than that at the moment. In all the countries we operate in, there is no clear sort of social contract between the insurance industry and the government about where private insurable risk lies and where the public picks up the bill. And you can see that by the withdrawal of insurance from several US states. But there's also just totally, I mean, most sectors are uninsured. European agriculture, for example, has no core insurance product, even though all European governments are funding agricultural insurance in the Caribbean and Africa at a sovereign level through parametric insurance pools. So I think it's just, there's a whole set of really fundamental things about what is the social contract on insurance, who's paying, who's compensating, where it goes. And that's mainly been because governments have not wanted to put climate risk on their balance sheet because they felt it would reduce fiscal space. So again, it comes back to lots of these accounting rules and the way IMF looks at things, which has meant that we're not having the policy discussions we need to have a workable insurance market and a workable public backstop, which is obviously going to have to happen. The insurer of last resort is always the government. So there has to be a foundation at some point. Where you draw that line is a policy question and a constitutional question in countries. But without that, you can't build the insurance house on no foundations in the public purse. It just doesn't exist.
Hi, Nick. Sasha Meckler. It's been a long time. And congratulations on this year's London Climate Week. It was really excellent. Some of the stuff, especially that the Brazilians were doing, I'm sure you had a hand in that, was phenomenal and certainly a lighthouse for many people. The question I ask is specifically referencing your point around the insurance sector and, you know, the things happening in LA and various other things, not to mention that insurers also have this massive spike in growth in cyber hacking, cyber security that is creating other problems and instability for them, among others. But the question is this of building consensus and all these coalitions we're building effectively driving us to a lowest common denominator. And certainly in financial markets, we've long used the idea of competition or competition within a regulated framework to drive out the best solutions to allow innovation and creative thinking to come to bear. Given the withdrawal of the US and others, when will we start looking at saying, well, maybe there are different approaches to transition and maybe different groupings which would seek to compete in terms of what pathway and what roadmap gets used to take us forward? Because if we are constantly waiting for everybody to be on board, the movement will always be the slowest and lowest common denominator.
No, I totally agree. And I think if you look at the progress made on climate change, it's been driven by competition as much as by cooperation. You know, it's competition that drove the cost of renewables down, driven by subsidies in Europe and European targets. So that balance of we agree cooperative targets, we use competition to drive the best solutions, and we have leadership coalitions. We run several global leadership coalitions, for example, on coal phase out, which is not about lowest common denominator. You can only join that club if you've committed to phase out coal on a time frame consistent with 1.5. And that is a place where people get confident support. The same on multilateral development banks. We score the multilateral development banks every year on their alignment with Paris precisely to set up a dynamic where their shareholders and their management are competing on quality, and people getting money from them can see who's providing the best support. So I do think we need to do that. And I think leadership coalitions around the next phase of transition planning, the next phase of macro resilience are super important. One of the problems in the other areas, we could give people direct benefits, you know, in terms of phasing out coal and aligning around MDBs, their shareholders wanted to do it. You know, again, it's back to the IMF. Countries say to us, why should we do this if we get no benefit in the market? I don't get cheaper money by investing more in resilience. So where's the kind of incentives for a leadership coalition, particularly for the most vulnerable countries? And I think that's where we need to find some dynamics where people take leadership role and they get rewarded in terms of good behavior. And there are some pilots around that. The UK has been working with private investors in Jamaica and Egypt, for example, but it's not yet mainstream. So I think that's one of the things we're really interested in doing, is exactly trying to find those leadership coalitions that produce positive feedbacks in terms of cost of capital, access to capital, and then encourage other people to come on board. Because just, yeah, working for a consensus opinion will not be the way we drive this process. It's just too complicated. You need to really want it to make the reforms needed, because there's plenty of other things governments have to do not related to climate that take up their time. So it's this competing, it's not climate, it's climate versus 15 other development or welfare priorities for governments to take on board. That's the game we're in now. It's not about climate denial, it's more about prioritization in their growth and sustainability and development portfolios. If the organizers, is there time for one more question, or is that okay? Okay, one more question.
Hello, my name's Lucky. I'm a project developer based in Sri Lanka, and I came to Climate Week, so it was great. I actually wanted to make a comment about the access to capital. So I'm working in a debt-distressed country called Sri Lanka, which recently defaulted. And when you have that situation, you actually have an opportunity to do something special. So we're working with the Prime Minister's Office of Singapore, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the Green Climate Fund, potentially Sumitomo Bank and HSBC, to access capital to actually early decommission the coal plant and issue transition credits. So a real world example of something that can happen. And if we pull this off, and hopefully within a relatively short time, because we've only got one coal plant, then you can actually demonstrate how a developing country, which has lots of renewable resources, can bypass this and leapfrog into a development agenda which is completely renewable. So I think this whole exercise needs is a real example of something that has happened in a country so that you can actually showcase it.
Yeah, so we're the Secretariat for the Coal Transitions Commission, which is led by France and others, precisely looking at those kind of deals in lots of places. And I think it's true that now the technology's moved on, that in terms of like-for-like new build, you would build renewables. It's really the issue of how you unwind infrastructure. Now, the UK got out of coal extremely quickly. That was mainly driven by the fact that our coal plants were old, and upgrading them for pollution rules, which coming into the European Union didn't make sense. So we hit our investment cycle very well. That wasn't an accident. That was a plan of our climate plan, was to hit that investment cycle. But in lots of places, particularly in Asia, that investment cycle isn't there. And so there's a mistiming. And I think that in terms of the post this year plans, we see that unwinding of coal infrastructure, and in Europe, the unwinding of gas infrastructure, which is kind of the next task here, is one of the important things, because marginal costs won't move it. It's too capital intense, too sunk cost. But we need to make change. And this is where actually some of the carbon trading credits and financial instruments are going to be really important. As you say, we need to do it a few times and people will follow. At the moment, it's a little too much PowerPoint and not quite enough investment, but really interesting example. And obviously Indonesia is also looking at similar deals. So thanks very much. I'll finish there, and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Nick. We'll now begin our panel discussion on transition finance in the UK and in Japan to look at the opportunities and challenges and how the UK and Japan can collaborate on solutions. So please join me in welcoming our panelist, Mr. Ishikawa, Chief Regulator Engagement Officer from MUFG, Dr. Christine Cho, CEO of Tracker Group, Mr. David Samaya, Executive Chairman of Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management, and David Harris, Head of Strategic Finance Initiatives and Partners. The discussion will be moderated by Ms. Natsuho Tori, Head of Sustainability at Japan Exchange Group. And following the discussion, we'll have some time also to take a few questions from the audience. Please.
Shall we? Do we have 60 minutes or we need to? Do we have 60 minutes or we need to close at 12? Okay, not sure, but.
We'll figure out. We'll figure it out.
Okay.
Once we're done, we're done.
So hello everyone and welcome to the panel. So as we've heard so far, both Japan and the UK has been addressing the importance of transition finance. And transition finance is an important tool in the shift to a low carbon economy, helping companies, especially high emission industry, decarbonization by ensuring the access to the capital to boost innovation and the shift. It seems to have a lot of potential, but as we've heard from Vanessa, the implementation is not that straightforward. So at this panel, we're going to discuss opportunities and challenges facing transition finance and UK-Japan collaboration as well. I'm Natsuho Tori, Head of the Sustainability at the Japan Exchange Group, and we have amazing panelists from both Japan and the UK. And already the moderator already introduced you, so we can jump into the discussion. So let's start the discussion from the opportunity side. I'll start with David. We have two David today. So David Harris, H.
David H. David Harris. Yes.
Yeah, cool.
That's what I said.
So David H. So you have been involved in lots of transition finance related work, including transition finance market review, TPT, G funds. And could you please share your thoughts on the opportunity of the transition finance for financial sector business community and society as a whole? And I also want to hear your, if you highlight some of the key takeaways from last week's Climate Action Week, because I've heard a lot of things happened on the transition finance last week. Please.
Great. Well, thank you, Natsuho. It's great to be here. Maybe it's just worth, by way of context, explaining a little bit just on who LSEG is before I come on to it and how we're approaching this. So we're well known for our exchange, London Stock Exchange, a very important part of the business, obviously helping companies raise and issuers on raising green bonds, helping companies around their reporting. But we also have our data and analytics division. So we came together with Refinitiv, the Thomson Reuters financial data business a few years ago. We went from 5,000 people to 25,000 people. That's the largest part of the group. So we're providing a lot of the climate data and analytics, which the investor and bank community are using. Another important division on this agenda is our FTSE Russell division, where, and I'll talk maybe a bit more later on about climate transition indexes and some of the big shifts we're seeing there. But I think it's worth starting off just, linking in with all the discussion we've been hearing today in opportunities and risks, climate change, the industrial transition to a lower carbon and more resilient economy is both a huge set of different risks and a huge set of different opportunities. The implications, if the world doesn't manage to stay on track at 2 degrees or under, if the world heads more towards 3 degrees or 4 degrees, and obviously a lot of the scientists are talking about positive feedback loops, which you potentially hit after 2 degrees, then big chunks of the world, if we go beyond 4 degrees, become uninhabitable. The implications, not just for kind of society and nature, but also for markets and the economy, are pretty dramatic. And I think what's really important is that a lot of the long-term kind of stewards of the economy, pension funds, institutional investors, are very focused around this. So we do a survey every year of asset owners around the world, the largest asset owners. We've been doing it now for over a decade. And interestingly, 5 years ago, we reached a point where over half of them said that they were looking to try and integrate these considerations into the way they invest. You roll that forward to today, it's 80%. And if you look at the very largest, the ones with over about 10, 20 billion in assets, then it's 85% of them are looking to integrate this into their total portfolios. So some people talk about the kind of ESG market or climate market as if it's this little bit on the side. It's not. This is the way institutional investors are now operating. It's the way they're trying to integrate it into their total investment strategy. I think what's also helpful is to kind of break it down into the different, because there's different opportunities across the different components of it. And a few times today, we've been hearing about the ways to try and categorize transition finance. And so if we kind of zoom in on those, which kind of came from GFANZ, also have been picked up by the Transition Finance Market Review here. There are 4 categories which Vanessa was talking about. So you've got the climate solutions category, and this is obviously all of the technologies which are going to help drive the decarbonisation and provide the solutions. And so and there is a colossal opportunity there. We've been trying to measure and define the green economy and define the kind of what are the products that help deliver the solutions to our big environmental problems like climate change. And we've been doing that for over a decade. And based on our green revenue classification system, if you look at every large company, the largest 4,000 companies, and you look at what percentage of their revenue are coming from, we define 133 green microsectors. If you add up all of that and you then multiply each company by their market cap, the total investment opportunity here is about 8 trillion just in equities. And the combined, the CAGR, the compound annual growth rate, if you treated that as an industry, is 15%, an average of 15% over the last decade. Highly volatile sectors, but that's the second highest level of growth after technology. So great opportunities around that. We also heard about all of the IEA numbers earlier, so I won't go into those. So good opportunity on the solution side. The second and third categories I often really see together. That's the aligned and the aligning. And this is really relevant across every sector of the economy. And I guess we'll maybe talk a bit later on about transition plans and why that getting really credible, good information about how companies are decarbonising. So that you can start to understand who are going to be the winners and potentially who are going to be the losers across each sector is really important. The last category is the managed phase out. And that's the one where it really requires a lot more kind of concessionary capital, carbon markets potentially. Just in Asia Pacific, the 5,000 coal-powered plants, which many of which are quite young and going to need early retirement if we're going to hit a lot of the global targets. So how do you enable early retirement of those kinds of assets? So I think, I'll leave it there. We can pick up some other things later.
Thank you. And maybe like a bit of takeaway from
takeaway, London Climate Week. So London Climate Week, and Nick and I were talking about this just before over the break. We went, it doubled in size from 350 events, 700 events this year, in an era where some people are saying, are things going backwards here? I think it was really important just to show just the level of momentum and shift going on. The Brazilian delegation here, we were hearing, what was it, 30, 40 from just the COP team. We had not only the kind of COP president and the high-level champions, 5 different ministers, but we had huge levels of people coming from right around the world, but also some really important deals getting done, that engagement between business, finance, and policymakers. So important, and really important that we have these moments coming up to COP. So I think it was fantastic, and look forward to seeing more international collaboration again in future years.
Thank you. And so now turn to the Ishikawa-san. You're here last week as well. So like, if you have any comments from takeaway from the Climate Week that I want to ask, hear from you. But in Japan, we can talk about I want to hear about the banking sector, what's happened around the banking sector. So in Japan, the policymakers and the financial institution focus on the potential of the transition finance from a relatively early stage. And banking sector play a very important role and leading role in driving and financing the transition, especially in Japan. And the MUFG is a leading role, has at the front and setting the transition finance evaluation frameworks and publish the white paper, etc. So how do you see the opportunity for the banking sector? And also, I want to hear about their policy, because you often mention the importance of policy in this regard. So could you elaborate on this?
Sure, thank you very much. I was going to say same thing. We have water, but no glasses. So don't get some glasses.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And thank you very much for hosting, and thank you very much for the invitation. And thanks for bringing some glasses for us. Maybe I'll start by saying, so I'm a Chief Regulatory Engagement Officer for MUFG. I mainly spend my time within MUFG Bank, but we also have asset management. We also have investment banking within our group. But mainly I'll be talking from a commercial banking perspective. Thank you very much. My role as a Chief Regulatory Engagement Officer is to bridge policymakers and private finance. But now I'm spending more time kind of rather than just bridging one bridge between policymaker and private finance, I guess now government, our corporate clients, and us, private finance. So it's a 3-way bridge I'm trying to build. So last week I was here in London, but yesterday I was in Brussels. 2 days ago I was in Seville, which some of you may be there, where the development finance conversation was 46 degrees. So very nice weather out there, but very good discussions as well. Clearly, somebody told me Glasgow moment 4 years ago. Now it was a Seville moment to discuss this development finance. How can we mobilize the government funding, but to catalytically use private finance? But in terms of your question, opportunity, when I hear whether it's a COP, FFD4, wherever I go, I hear huge number of financing gap, whether it's $1 trillion. I think Seville, it was $4 trillion was the number. It's too big that I cannot count. But anyways, in theory, that $4 trillion means financing opportunity for you, for us, right? But how do you make this $1 trillion of financing gap as bankable? We use it bankable because we're a commercial bank, but people, I guess, in the previous discussions use investable. It's nuanced. I don't think it's exactly the same, but similar. But this is where I think it's important to consider the gap between bankable, investable, insurable. Insurance, yes, Tony, you're there. I just saw you came in. I think it's important that banks, asset manager, asset owner, insurance, we play important role, but not exactly the same role. So let me briefly discuss how we think about transition. Takada-san earlier discussed the importance of transition, but for us, transition is not something we can do on our own. And before talking about transition finance, I want to talk about transition because in simplest terms, transition finance is financing transition. And who is transitioning? Is it us? No, it's the real economy, right? Real economy need to transition and we finance their transition. So that's how we think about it. If you think about it very simply, what is transition finance? And the term I like is it takes two to tango, right? That's what I learned a few years ago. Same thing here. It takes two to transition. We cannot transition alone. We have transition plan. We have net zero commitment, but we cannot do this alone. We need to transition together with our clients. So our client transition is our transition. That's how we think about it. But it doesn't mean we're just waiting and say, hey, you are our clients, please transition, we'll finance. It's not simply as that, but we spend a lot of time with our clients. But at the end of the day, it's our client, government, us, all of us working together to ensure the system level transition. I think there was a comment earlier about systemic transition that needs to happen. What's more complicated in this conversation is that it takes more than two to transition, right? For auto sector, for steel, it's not just that company transitioning. It's the entire supply chain, both the upstream, but also downstream. Consumer needs to, for example, willing to pay higher price for like green steel. Without that, I don't think steel company will invest in green steel. Right? So it's the entire supply chain. And that's why it's government policy, us, corporates, we all need to work together. And I really want to stress the importance of technology roadmap, but it's not just the roadmap. Takada-san earlier showed the roadmap itself. The roadmap is important, but I don't think it's, I want to stress the process of roadmap development because we, the banks, were involved in the development of roadmap. So it's not like, government or the sector created and we were shown like, here's a roadmap, but we were part of the development. That's why we know what technology will be available 2030, 2035. And that predictability, policy kind of a shared vision is so important. So I believe that's also what's happening here in the UK as well. But if one sector prepares roadmap or taxonomy and say, here it is, I don't think we will be able to be part of this journey, but when you have banks, private sector, the technology, the sector in question, and also the government part of this development of roadmap, that's when you can start real momentum in kind of accelerating the transition. So rather than just focusing on transition finance, I think it's also important to talk about transition of the whatever the sector we're talking about, and what's the role of banks. But I can only talk about banks, but I'm sure insurance, asset owners, asset managers, we all need to play. And of course, infrastructure like LSEG and others, JPX as well. What's your role? What's your role? And what's my role? And what kind of framework or policy will enable the systemic transition? I think that's how we should be thinking rather than just talk about transition finance in abstract, because we spent 4 years talking about transition finance. Now it's about execution. Who needs to do what? I think that's what we are now focusing on. Maybe I'll stop there. Thank you. And I just need some water.
Thank you. So we've heard about the banking sector, and then you mentioned like each player in the financial market, not only financial market, but like financial sector have a role to play. So now turn to the David. So like, what's the opportunity for the asset management community? Also, you are the ambassador to the FinCity.Tokyo. So how do you think the financial center like London and Tokyo accelerate the transition finance, and not only transition finance, but transition itself, and benefit from it, especially in the time of geopolitically unstable?
Two big questions, but thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here again. I couldn't agree more with Ishikawa-san. We're focusing on transition finance specifically, which is fine, but I think we have to take a step back and look at, especially in Japan and Asia, where we've come from and how much progress we made in a very short time. Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Group is very involved on the banking side with actual transition finance, loans, et cetera. The asset management company, and by the way, the Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Group in aggregate manages close to $1 trillion US. I like to say we're the largest asset manager you've never heard of because we're a mouthful. But we really started engaging, I should say, we started on this journey, transition journey, after I guess came back to Japan in 2014, 2015, when the government pension fund, GPIF, made some very bold decisions, very, very bold decisions. And those decisions were on the back of the Prime Minister Abe and the administration at the time looking to really transform Japan from an economic perspective, and that led into huge, huge corporate governance changes, very, very ambitious, given the last 150 years of how Japan's business and economy have been structured to really, really turn that over. And we don't use the term anymore. It's really funny. Nobody mentions ESG anymore, which is a good thing. But actually, I think the G should have always come first. You got to get your governance right, and then you look at the other areas. Well, that focus, I like to say the sun, the moon, and the stars were aligned because we had the government, we had the stock exchange, we had the biggest pension fund in the world decide, you know what, we want to be responsible, we want to move forward, and we want to make changes. And so we had to deal with that meaning our clients, the asset owners, and this gets to the point of the entire value chain, the entire ecosystem, they have to be convinced because remember, the mandates that they give out are to us, the asset manager. We just don't have our own assets to manage and make decisions. So we have to work together with the asset owners. And the largest asset owner in Japan at the time said, we want to move forward. We want to move forward because we believe that it's the right thing to do, and we believe in the future that this transition will take time, but over time, those companies that transition actually will become mainstream. And that process, at the time, we didn't know how long it is, and today we don't know how long that time frame is. So we began engaging with our portfolio companies. We manage at Sumitam roughly US $750 billion, both Japanese assets and global assets. And when we first began engaging, we had a matrix. Who were the largest emitters and where would the impact be most felt? We had a matrix. We went about it before all of these frameworks were put in place. This goes back 7, 8 years. When we first started, even in Japan, we need a transition plan. We need to understand where you are. We got blank stares coming back at us. But over time, and now, our portfolio companies, our clients are very, very engaged. As you know, Japan is a consensus-driven society. It takes time to build that consensus, but we really have consensus now. And our model, and every asset manager has a different model in approaching this. Our model is engagement, not only bottom up, but top down. We have 24 people in our sustainable group that basically engages with our portfolio companies, and we have the president of the company and the chairman of the company also directly engaging with portfolio companies, both in Japan and outside Japan. The progress, are we making progress? Are we able to measure exactly every portfolio company, where they are they committed? Look, you can imagine larger companies have resources. We were at a panel yesterday, I was discussing this. Our group, and I'm sure all the groups here, have put in place lots of people, lots of headcount, have spent lots of money on consultants to pull together a plan, and we're executing on the plan. But if you look at mid-cap and small-cap companies listed in both the Tokyo Stock Exchange, but stock exchanges around the world, and you engage with these companies, they're focusing on their daily BAU. How do I make more money? How do I increase my profitability? And there's very little resources available still to this day, even with all of the guidelines, to implement changes. So what I can say is lots of progress, still a lot of work to do. The opportunity is absolutely huge. And I don't know if it's appropriate to talk about it now or later on, but I want to explain a little bit about how we run assets. Our clients give us specific mandates, or we set an investment objective for retail funds. Clients give us mandates on the institutional side. We have large clients that have said, we're going to allocate X% of our portfolio to a particular green index or a particular investment approach that focuses on sustainability. On the retail side, there's been a lot of noise around labeling certain funds green when they're not really green, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, I think that phase is totally past. On the retail side, we understand that in Japan anyway, retail investors are focused on the bottom line. They're not focused on the green headline. But moving to a much more mainstream approach and getting into specifically transition finance and transition bonds, our clients, let's say their allocation is 50% international equities, 50% domestic equities, 50% global bonds, and 50% domestic bonds. They give us a mandate. They can go down the credit scale only to, let's call it double B. The challenge is, how do we get transition bonds, transition loans mainstream? How can I convince my clients, our clients, instead of buying that double B bond or that corporate bond or investing in that private credit, how can I get the transition bond to be rated and it becomes just a natural choice when I'm looking at how to construct the portfolio to go into that? I need more issuance, I need more volume, I need more liquidity, I need more depth. I also need the asset owners to understand why it's important to include those bonds, and I need the index providers to be on board, because we have a value chain here that is not just us, not just the asset owners, it's the index providers, it's a whole number of players. So we've made a lot of progress, lots of challenges, lots of opportunities. And your second question.
And the opportunity for a city and how to, like London, Tokyo, can accelerate the transition fund.
Transition. So I travel around the world meeting a lot of investors and prospects on behalf of both FinCity and on behalf of our organization. I have never seen more interest in Japan since I first was involved in Japan. I first went to Japan in 1980, in the 80s and the bubble years. These past 5 years, we have seen an amazing amount of interest to allocate capital to opportunities, and Japan is now one of those opportunities. For all the reasons I spoke about, corporate governance changes, et cetera, et cetera. We're also seeing, and it may be a bit controversial, as we heard earlier, the geopolitical changes. And in fact, it isn't just geopolitical changes on the Atlantic side, it's also on the Pacific side. It used to be investors looked at Asia ex-Japan. Now it's Asia ex-Japan, ex-China. So China is a separate category, ex-Japan is, Asia is a separate category, and Japan is now a separate category. A lot of interest in all kinds of inbound investment. Given what's going on and what was mentioned in the earlier by the speaker, Climate Week in the UK attracted more people, more participants than ever. And here's a great opportunity, because there may be a big player, again, on the other side of the Atlantic who's, the headline is pulling back. Actually, underneath, there are many, many states, many, many investors who are not pulling back. Instead of green shouting, they're green whispering. They're whispering about what they're doing. That's okay. But the opportunity for Japan and the UK, follow best practice, work together. I can give you specific examples of where we've already made investments here in the UK as a Japanese asset manager. But the rest of the world is moving forward, and I think we're both leaders in this area, and we need to continue. So,
Thank you. We've heard a lot from the investors and the financial sector side. Now, Christine, you have so like a Carbon Tracker conducted lots of deep dive analysis on the corporate company level climate transition globally and support investors' engagement, including CA100 Press. So how do you observe the progress and opportunity? I mean, we've had a bit about this, but like the progress of the companies, especially in Japan and the UK, and if possible, like, could you share some examples with us?
It'd be my pleasure. But first of all, thank you very much, FinCity.Tokyo, for the kind invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. For those who don't or haven't heard of Carbon Tracker, it was founded in 2010 by two visionary investor or financial professional, Mark Campanelli, and also Nick Robbins, who was heading HSBC Climate Change of Excellence at the time. In fact, there was actually an FT Financial Times article that talks about this story and how the two came up with the concept of unburnable carbon and the carbon budget. And that was really marked the beginning of how the financial services industry embed climate change considerations in the financial analysis. And I quote from the FT that this think tank helped to popularize the idea of the carbon budget and stranded assets. And in the flagship report in 2011, it talks about the potential of London-listed fossil fuel companies was more than 10 times bigger than all the carbon due to be emitted until 2050 under the UK climate targets. And the idea took off, and until in September 2015, the whole discussion about carbon bubble hit the prime time, and Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England at the time, actually gave a speech about this. So we're very proud of our heritage in being able to highlight the financial materiality of climate change. But it is not just about risks, it is also about opportunities. So in order to conduct our analysis, we come up with a series of flagship reports because for investors, continuity, consistency, and comparability is most important. So in our flagship reports, such as Paris Maligned series, we look at the high carbon emission sector, especially oil and gas, in how their transition is aligned with the 1.5 degrees transition. There's also another series called Flying Blind, looking at the quality of disclosure of companies, looking at their audit and quality so that we can continue to assess these companies. Going on to some examples, I want to highlight that we do cover companies like Enios. I think is one of the oil and gas companies that Climate Action 100. And we're seeing really good progress in terms of the company providing better information on impairment testing. And it is only in the most recent assessment that they refer to the IEA scenario. We're also seeing, for example, Toray, is the chemicals industry, is also in Climate Action 100. We've given it a good green light on climate-related disclosures. We particularly like that it has good disclosure on a scenario analysis. As you know, for investors, it's important to see what are the underlying assumptions of companies when they come up with scenario analysis so that individual investors can make their choices when they align their investment decision-making with such disclosure and the assessment. We're also pleased to see that, for example, Panasonic is one of the very few companies that we have given a green light on the short term, medium term. So short term is 2027, medium term is 2035, and long term is 2050 on their net zero alignment. So there are loads of good examples we can find in Japan. In the UK, I will be a little bit more stringent on scrutinizing, and I would like to resonate with David. G is key, which is an acronym we have in ICGN. Governance comes first. And on that front, investors are very concerned about BP. Because for a number of years, BP put the climate transition plan on the AGM for shareholders to vote, to harness the support, to understand the shareholder support. But when it had a U-turn and change of the strategy, there wasn't a shareholders vote. And I think that this is something for investors and asset owners to think about, whether it is a governance issue, is also a climate-related issue. For companies like Shell, which is also very important in the UK for a long time, we see that on the positive side, there's more scenario disclosure. It is probably one of the best companies, oil and gas companies globally have we would say, on scenario disclosure. And so they're taking sort of more balance sheet actions in winding down based on the disclosure, which we're pleased with. However, it's focus on LNG. It is something that we still want to have a further discussion about in terms of this Rowan's transition. And in this year's, in our Paris-Milan report, we have included methane emissions for oil gas. And then I think that is another area that we need to continue to focus on as well. So examples-wise, I hope that gives a bit of flavor. I'll be happy to give a little bit more later.
Thank you very much. So we've already started hearing about the challenges, but we can explore more about the challenges and maybe possible solutions as well. So I want to ask Ishikawa-san and David S. Could you, could you share us what challenges you're facing and how do you think you can tackle them? And financial institution needs to evaluate the credibility of the corporate transition pathway. And you already mentioned that Japanese government provides sectorial roadmaps. How useful, you already touched on, but how useful are the roadmap? And the EU, on the other hand, has a taxonomy. And if possible, if you have any thoughts on the taxonomy, please share with us.
Sure. So in terms of challenge, I think I have time to share 3 items, but if I talk too much, just say shut up and I'll shut up, I think. So first one, I think it's important to share the concept that Takada-san, I think you mentioned transition is dynamic. I would say it's dynamic, but very context dependent. And I'll give you one example, something I learned 2 weeks ago when I was in Shanghai. And I can be a bit more diplomatic, but I thought it's interesting to share this, which is, Nakatsu-san, you mentioned this ASEAN taxonomy earlier, and there's this transition labeling or category. In one of ASEAN country, they designate coal power plants as transition. And not that we have strict ban, we cannot finance that. But that's one of the taxonomies that ASEAN country has. And why is it? It's not because they want to build more coal, but coal power plants for the purpose of nickel and aluminum smelting. And that is basically for the purpose of EV supply chain. So if you look at the end of what their strategic goal, you all agree, I'm sure, for ASEAN, if you want to build an EV factory, I'm sure you will say that's a great idea. But if you see the behind the scene, it's the nickels, aluminum produced using coal, I'm sure you will say that's horrible. But which side do you want to look at? And we, as a 6th largest Indonesian bank, we cannot ignore the government or strategic initiative of Indonesia or Thailand or Philippines, right? So again, not that we want to do more of a coal financing. We have strict policy not to finance coal. But if you think about the broader economic transition or industrialization strategy of ASEAN countries, that's exactly what's happening, right? And that's why the transition is context dependent. We need to understand, respect to some extent, but at the same time, we need to be mindful that carbon budget is limited, right? You can't just say, oh yeah, you do whatever we want. We'll try everything we can, right? It's a collective effort, but we need to understand the context. So that's one. Second, I think there's the understanding or understanding that finance can drive transition or banks can drive transition. We can support or enable transition. But what we do is when there's demand for finance, we can supply. But we cannot go to our client and say, you have to do this or that. You know, the power balance between asset manager, asset owner company versus us and our corporate clients, it's different. We need to make them happy because they pay us interest rate. if I go to our client and you have to do this X, Y, and Z, I would be told the exit is there. Goodbye, and you don't have to come back. So that's why banks have our role to play, but asset owners, asset managers have different role to play, insurance too. So that, who kind of can deliver or accelerate transition, I think we need to have a shared understanding rather than kind of say, oh, private finance, you have the responsibility to drive transition, because we all can do part of it, but we cannot own transition. Lastly, I often hear taxonomy, disclosure, et cetera, that will accelerate transition. Yes and no. I mean, that will clearly help. I'm not against disclosure. I'm not against this taxonomy. But for example, SMEs, would that be applicable to SMEs or unlisted companies? No. But we serve SMEs or unlisted companies too. If I go to our client and say, you have to do all ISSB disclosure and then we can do transition finance, they'll say, no. We don't have the resource to do that. So we have to be proportionate, right? But at the end of the day, it's a systemic transition that we have to do. So, it's interesting, when our CRO, when I briefed him about this transition finance, he basically said, in a few years, all of financing that we do has to be transition finance, whether it's labeled as transition finance or more broadly considered as transition finance. Either way, in the next few years, we need to get to a stage, all the financing, all the investment that we do will be kind of broadly considered transition finance. So the term I would use is everything, everywhere, all at once. We call it ebu in Japan. But basically, transition finance has to be everything, everywhere, all at once. Hopefully soon, not like 10 years from now, but maybe that's where we are already today. But that has to be mainstream in Japan, in the UK, but including all emerging economies, Asia, Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So challenge, but how do we address that challenge? Everything, everywhere, all at once is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Any thoughts?
I mean, absolutely agree with everything said. I don't have a lot to add other than I wish I had a magic wand. Magic wand would be poof, everybody is at the same place, moving forward, making the same progress. The reality is every region in the world is a bit different, and every company that's in our portfolio is a bit different. And do we push really hard on certain companies? I think we're just getting started in Japan with group engagement, which is now something. And just getting back to how we work together with the UK, because I think it's a great point. We've actually signed it's like a joint venture, an engagement joint venture about 6-7 years ago with a very, very large UK asset manager to help us with our passive investment portfolio outside of Japan. And we work very, very closely with them. And we also have, and this is a point that has come up earlier, data. How good is the data? How clean is the data? Is the data appropriate? Who's doing it? We actually invested in a specific, sustainable asset manager focused on data who has 15 years of disclosure information before any of this was popular. We made this investment about 2 years ago. So the cooperation between the UK and Japan to help solve some of these issues, I think, is really, really important. So there's the macro, magic wand, we all wish we had it, but then you have to go in case by case, company by company, region by region, different taxonomies, different roadmaps. But those roadmaps are built because economies are at different stages of development. Companies have different pressures, profit pressures, different stages in terms of corporate governance. We have to be flexible on the one hand, but we have to push on the other hand. It's not an easy answer.
Thank you. There's something like we haven't touched on it, just something like important for the transition finance. I think the transition plan. So I'm keen to discuss the value of the corporate climate transition plan and why is for the David. Why is the information useful for the investors and the financial sector?
Great, thank you. So I think, coming on to transition plans, which I think connects into all of this, there's really kind of two parts here. So one is why, as you say, why is transition plan information important? and needed by the investor community. And then we'll actually, let's unpack this a bit. What is a transition plan? So we've been talking about the level of shift going on across institutional investors. And David was talking about GPIF, obviously the largest asset owner in the world. But we're seeing pension funds globally get very focused on how to integrate this into their total investment portfolios across all asset classes. And they need incredible forward-looking information about how a company is shifting their business models. This really links into when we were talking about the different categories. I was talking about, there's the solutions bit. This is the aligned and the aligning. All that was coming up on the charts earlier with the kind of the amber categories. So this is the information that helps you kind of navigate that part of it. And just to give you a sense of the shift that we're seeing, we have our index business, FTSE Russell, works with asset owners around the world, and often. And one of the big shifts going on here is with these kind of indexes. Typically, when a pension fund selects an index for their passive portfolios, they stick with it for decades. It's very conservative. You're investing across the entire market. You don't tend to mess around with it. But this is one of the things causing disruption in passive portfolios, is that large asset owners are looking at how they switch from traditional benchmarks into ones that are climate adjusted. Now, initially, these were quite simplistic. There's a lot of discussion about kind of carbon footprints and trying to reduce the emissions associated with the portfolio. Now, actually, just looking at the level of emissions in the portfolio, I don't think is actually a very effective way of addressing the issue. It simply means that maybe you're invested less in some of the higher carbon companies, but other investors are going to be invested in them. It's also not going to create much change. And so the big shift that's going on is bringing this forward-looking information into the design of the indexes. And I mean, actually, Faith got mentioned earlier on at the back, but deserves credit for helping set up an initiative called the Transition Pathway Initiative back in 2016, 2017. We've got David Russell, who chairs it, sitting in the other corner. But this was a kind of asset owners coming together with academics to get credible analysis, in this case with the London School of Economics, and saying we need a consistent set of information to enable us to be able to integrate this into our portfolios. And there were two parts to it. One was actually the governance bit we've been talking about. So what they call the TPI Management Quality Score, which is actually, has the company got the right kind of credible systems put in place? And then the other part is the carbon performance, which is then much more sector specific. What is the pathway? And we had obviously a discussion around different sector pathways earlier, which is a very complex area. Different industries and companies will give you one set of pathways. They're more kind of like bottom up when you work with the companies, but you also get more of, if you're trying to achieve a certain level of global emissions reduction, often if you add up those different industry pathways, they don't give you the level you need to achieve. And so it's very useful getting academics involved in it to come up with what does credible pathways sector by sector look like, and therefore how good a company's short-term, medium, long-term targets link to the particular pathway that they need to achieve. So we've now starting to be using that within the index design. And what is really helpful for a lot of the asset owners is they're engaging with the companies around transition plans, whether they're credible enough. But this is a way then to also link directly the investment flows into that too. So it also empowers that engagement. So on one hand, a lot of the companies will say, well, we get ESG teams coming and engaging with us, but we have a completely different discussion with the portfolio manager. But this way of actually linking it into index investing means that the very structure of those passive portfolios is effectively reinforcing the engagement, because companies put weight in those indexes and the equivalent portfolios is going up if the company's improving, and the investment in them is being reduced if they're not. So there's a big need for it. Coming on to, well, what are these things? So there was work done originally, there was a lot of work that GFANZ did, stuff which effectively came out of COP26 in Glasgow, but GFANZ came up with a work stream which we were both involved in, which was based, what is the expectations from the entire financial sector for real economy transition plans? What is it we want to see in them? And a structure was come up with there. Then you also had the Transition Plan Task Force, which also came out of COP26. It was a UK-led initiative, but quite global in its outlook and approach, and took the same structure from GFANZ and then built that out in terms of what is a proper framework for transition plans. And what's really exciting now is that ISSB, getting that consolidation, we don't want multiple frameworks, ISSB has taken that on, and just last week published their guidance on transition plans and links it also very much into S2. So these are very strategic documents or strategic sets of information. TPT talked about a strategic and rounded approach to transition plans. So this is not just about decarbonisation, also the risks and opportunities. It links also in with resilience, but it's also about whole economy transition, because we've got to have some realism here. Companies cannot do this alone. The finance sector cannot do this alone. It's the connection between them, but also with governments and policymakers. We need national transition plans, and we need the right engagement between those parties. Part of a transition plan is explaining your engagement. What do you need from other parts of the economy? What do you need from governments to enable your decarbonisation as well? And so it also provides a framework, hopefully, for very effective engagement between these different sectors.
Thank you. What's going on around the transition planning, and like we just heard about the importance of the transition plan, Christine. So what do you think about the challenges for the corporate to make a effective, informative transition plan? And if there is any good examples, examples are very helpful to understand. So could you share?
Yes, I have 3 examples.
Thank you.
Company examples. The first one I want to talk about is J-Power. At the time, I was involved in, I was in the asset manager, and our team was one of the 3 key fund managers in filing the first investor-led shareholder proposal to ask for coal phase out and linking this performance, sustainability performance to remuneration. I think it was really marked the first investor-led sort of investor stewardship push in this area for coal power plants, and that was in 2022. For those who haven't been involved in filing a shareholder proposal, first of all, if you don't have to, don't.
Exactly.
Because it's very costly. It takes a lot of time. It's really worth doing. And at the time, I think that group of managers wasn't sure what we could achieve. And there were lots of challenges I won't go into because it's quite long. But in the end, in 2024, J-Power actually committed to closing down 5 coal power plants by 2040. It does show that with the right approach, with a science-based approach, and the kind of with a respectful way in aligning with the country plan to phase out fossil fuel, there is power in investor stewardship. But we need to do it with respect. As Ishikawa said, it takes 2 to tango, and for me, it's almost like a sport, like in dressage, because I'm a horse rider, and Japan has the oldest dressage rider in the world. And remember, you can't, as a rider cannot make a horse to do anything, but the horse is the one who delivers performance. So the only thing you can do well is to help the horse to prepare, so that in the end, the combined performance is what we see as good. That's the first example I want to give. The second one is Nippon Steel. I saw earlier in the GX plan about the 1.8 billion investment from the government in the steel industry. That's actually for Nippon Steel itself. So Nippon Steel needs capital to invest in the electric arc furnace to support to move away from the blast furnace. But in an engagement with a company, we understand that the demand side from customer is also an issue. There are different types of green steel that Nippon Steel has been producing for many years. But finding the right customers and making sure that there is enough demand for it will be important to create that return on investment. And I think that working on the demand side is what you talked about in terms of the ecosystem, and David as well, the importance of ecosystem. The third example I'd like to highlight is Toyota. For any incumbents in the industry, it's actually very difficult to change. It is possible because in the ICE car, the production facility, the people that is needed is very, very different from an EV production. On the positive side, Toyota has improved Scope 3 Category 11 disclosure. And over the last few years, investors can now meet with independent board directors. They can meet with senior independent director. We still haven't been able to meet with Toyota, I understand, unless you're maybe Warren Buffett, but who knows? Or maybe David.
No.
Yes. So recently, Toyota managed to sell, has promoted a $15,000 EV cars in China, and the pre-order demand was so high that it crashed the server. So there is ways of knowing that there are opportunities in the new business. Toyota is committed to a multi-pathway approach in terms of its business model, but I would challenge as it continues this model, how long would it last, and what would be the internal arrangements of the structure that is going to continue to support it. And the last example I want to give is actually Fujifilm, which everybody knows that it successfully transitioned from being a film provider to sort of a material science and chemistry company. And I remember listening to a podcast from that CEO who made that transition and great leap of faith. He said he created the cash cow business, which continues with a very different culture of producing film. And then there's a separate unit of innovation going into healthcare, going into pharma, going into cosmetics. I wanted to wonder, is Toyota able to learn from successful Japanese companies that have successfully transitioned? And welcome a dialogue.
Thank you. We still have a lot to discuss, but maybe like time is coming, but maybe like we can have there are 1 or 2 questions from the floor. So yes, please.
Thank you very much. De-risking the cost of capital, I think, is essential to the energy transition. Who should we look to that for? To governments, development banks, or the insurance industry? And in addition, from our Japanese participants, rising or normalization of Japanese interest rates. The yen's been the funding currency for many, many years, and now we have a normalization of rates. Is that a positive or negative to the transition?
So happy to kick off. So as I said earlier, I represent commercial bank, and unfortunately, it's not my money; it's our depositors' money, right? So we have to be prudent in terms of how we manage our depositors' money, and we need to have sufficient capital to ensure, and we are also in charge of settlement, right? We're not just lending; that's it. We have huge responsibility of settling a lot of transactions, millions and millions of transactions every single day. So what does that mean? It means we want to, of course, support transition, support adaptation, support the infrastructure development, everything, but ensuring that what we finance will meet risk-adjusted return expectation. Because again, we are responsible for the financial system, but also the depositors. And that's why blended finance is so important. We can't just go to, I don't know, a African country and say, oh yeah, we lend to you if you pay 8% every year, whatever the number is, right? So how can we lower the cost of capital, but at the same time, we meet the risk adjusted return expectation. And that's where the public sector needs to come in. And it's paradoxical, but they need to take higher risk, but lower return. So normally, if you take higher risk, you want higher returns. But in the context of this, adaptation or mitigation, hopefully whether it's the MDBs or other institutions can take higher risk, lower returns. But then the question, I think what we're now at the point is, we shouldn't just think about risk as what's being presented, but really understand what kind of risk are we talking about? Is it political risk? Is it FX risk? Is it credit risk? And you can certainly distribute the risk, and that's some of the funds that we launched will share different risk to different stakeholders. So when I say blended finance, I'm not just talking about we lend senior MDB like World Bank or ADB, just lending equity portion, but rather it's more about risk sharing among all the stakeholders like pension fund and other like insurance company who can take longer risk. So there are so many innovation that we, at least private sector, is developing together with the public sector. So you know, it's not like scaled yet, but there are a lot of opportunities, a lot of ideas being developed by the private sector. But clearly, when the funding cost goes up, of course, the risk-adjusted return expectation will go up as well. So it's not easy, but we're not just saying, oh, yeah, if you pay me a lot of money, we can lend to you. It's not simple as that. We're trying to come up with a solution for the purpose of financing infrastructure, adaptation, resilience in emerging economies too.
A lot has been said about insurance in the past week. Actually, in the past year or so, insurance has really become a lot more prominent in the discussion. But when it comes to insurance companies and the role they can play, we need to understand that there are different parts of the insurance companies that have different mandates. So if we're talking about the insurability of physical assets, the physical impact of climate change, is insurance affordable? Is it available? Then we need to look at the underwriting team. A lot of them would say that, well, we reprice every year, so that's not a problem. We don't actually need to look long term. But it is possible to come up with innovative financial instruments. I've come across most recently the sustainability-linked insurance discount. So it was a real estate company working with Marsh and AXA, looking at what might be the preventative measures that can be put in place in the real estate that can help reduce with proven evidence of enhancing resilience. And based on that paper that I've read, about 9%, about up to 20% discount that could get. And so this is something that is really helpful for businesses because it really shows that it can hit the bottom line. And for the insurance part that is managing the balance sheet, Solvency II has it's a regulation for regulation for insurance companies. Insurance company has to manage the asset and liabilities according to very stringent regulations. So they can't just say that, well, we are long-term asset owners, or we can just invest in anything. I think it really comes down to working closely with investment consultants, working out what is the regulatory compliant approach and sort of revisiting the asset allocation strategy. But there is a lot of appetite, especially on nature-based solutions. But that's a further conversation. Last comment.
Just, and this is not related to Japan, but as someone who lived in Florida for 20 years of my life, I think there really needs to be a very public, deliberate discussion, debate around moral hazard, around property insurance, for example. I think Florida and California, Los Angeles comes to mind. Los Angeles, those fires, we had about 50 years ago, a very similar experience. By the way, Richard Nixon's house was burned down 50 years ago in a very similar experience, but nothing really was done. So you have the moral hazard question that we have in banking, and we really focused on both in 2008, 2009, and recently in Silicon Valley Bank. We haven't, in some jurisdictions, have not had that discussion. And that really is front and center because I'm focusing on the United States. So many millions of people have moved and are living right next to the ocean. And if you look at when the pricing of that, maybe this relates to carbon pricing because that can be helpful here, but there's a huge mismatch, and you have to pay for it. There's no other way. My humble opinion. Yeah.
We can continue discussion forever, but probably time to close. But sorry, maybe like you can ask a question like after we close the session. So thank you so much for joining us, and then thank you for the panelists sharing such a great insight. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the panelists for a very rich and engaging discussion. To formally close the event, can I ask Matsuda-san back to the stage to deliver a short closing remarks?
Well, let me say in a few words for closing remarks of this event. Well, I'm very delighted that many experts from the public and private sector of Japan and the UK could have a very fruitful and lively discussion on transition finance. I'd like to once again express my sincere gratitude to everyone involved in this event. Nowadays, Japan and the UK are becoming more and more important global strategic partners. And I think there is a huge potential for Japan-UK financial cooperation because of three reasons. First, Japan and the UK have a common agenda for the economic growth. The UK government is focusing on growth and international competitiveness in the financial and professional services sector, as Chancellor Reeves stated on various occasions. In Japan, the government is delivering a variety of initiatives to revitalize Japanese economy, including the promotion to make Japan a leading asset management center. And the second, the financial regulators from Japan and the UK are closely working with each other. For example, the third meeting of the Japan-UK Financial Regulatory Forum was held in London in January this year. I'm glad to confirm that Japan and the UK are interested in many common issues such as sustainable finance, asset management reforms, digital finance, and banking regulation. Third, bilateral financial cooperation is also taking root between local governments. For example, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government and the City of London Corporation signed an MOU on cooperation in financial services in 2017. So I think today's event demonstrates the strong cooperative partnership between the two cities. Well, lastly, I believe that Japan and the UK have great potential to cooperate further in promoting transition finance. And the financial services sector can play a major role for promoting transition finance. I'm confident that the partnership between the two countries for sustainable transition finance will become stronger in the years ahead. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Matsuda-san. So this concludes our formal program. So I'd like to say thank you very much to all the speakers and the panelists for a very insightful discussion and fresh insights. And also, of course, the audience for your participation in our event. We do have lunch prepared, so if you would like to go to the next room, that's where I think the lunch is for networking and the reception. And I was just told that when you leave the room, when you leave the event, it would be great if you could leave your name tag on that table. So thank you very much again.